Welcome back, everyone, to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization Show, the home of Googleization Nation, where we talk with HR and business thought leaders about the crazy shift going on all around us and explore the disruptive convergence of technology, business, and people. Here are your hosts, Ira Wolf and Jason Cochran.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization. Thank you for being part of Googleization Nation. I'm Ira Wolf.
And I'm Jason Cochran. If you think this is just another podcast, think again. We're the voice of the most important conversations on the future of work, confronting business leaders and people today. And as you know well by now, our goal is to bring you ways to reimagine tomorrow and explore the ever-changing convergence of business, technology, and people.
Googleization Nation, brace yourselves, because this week we're diving deep into the murky and tumultuous waters of, drumroll please, organizational culture. Before I go any further, let's start with the definition of culture. Something, it seems, has been studied to death, and yet we don't seem to be any further at figuring it out than we were when I entered this industry 30 years ago. But I read something from a recent article from today's guest. It was published just a few weeks ago. Culture is how we do things around here. My description is this. It's an invisible glue that either holds an organization together or it turns it into a crumbling cookie. Now, you might just be thinking, here we go again. Another consultant, another podcast hyping another theory about company culture. It's another model. Well, you're going to want to keep listening because we've got stats and facts from one of the leading authorities on employee engagement and culture in the world. According to Gallup, only 2 out of 10 employees feel strongly connected to their organization's culture. That's right, 2, as in you can count them on one hand and still have fingers left to snap along to your favorite song. And if you think that's shocking, McKinsey tells us that 70% of transformations fail. And can you guess why? Well, 70% of those failures are due to culture-related issues. So after the billions of dollars and probably trillions of dollars spent on transformative leadership, change management, employee engagement, that's just downright embarrassing and somewhat appalling. So we're going to address the elephant in the room today, also remote and hybrid work, which is one of the more transformative and disruptive forces impacting business today. But thankfully, Gallup is all over it, and we are grateful and humbled to have Vibhas Ratanji, Gallup Senior Practice Leader, with us. We're going to be talking about what's the deal with all these culture change programs that seem to go wrong. But before we bring on Vibhas to the Googleization stage, let's jump into the perfect labor storm, where each week we focus on a disruptive, surprising, or worrisome trend that we believe you should know. So this survey just found its way into my inbox this morning, and it seems quite fitting for today's episode. The idea that work sucks is everywhere. There's something that's called the Joy Barometer. And the Joy Barometer survey asks one question. Overall, how joyfully do you feel you are living at present? Using a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 means not at all. Well, 66% of the respondents said 7 or less, and 1/3 was 5 or less. Very few people gave it 8 or higher. Now, this is consistent with something you've heard me quote many, many times, the Gallup State of the Workplace Survey, 2023, which indicates that 6 in 10 people are emotionally detached at work, 60%, and 18%, almost 1 out of 5, are miserable. Only 23% are thriving at work. 59%, yes, this is still a thing, 59% are quiet quitting, and 18% are loud quitting. And get this, 51% of currently employed workers say they are watching for and actively seeking a new job, more than half. And if those numbers don't get your attention, maybe this one will. Gallup estimates that low engagement costs the global economy $8.8 trillion. That's with the T, folks. Trillion dollars, 8.8 trillion. That's 9% of global GDP, enough to make the difference between success and a failure of humanity.
It feels like Gallup's kind of been an honorary member of Googleization Nation for some time now, given that their data, it comes up in nearly every episode that we've done the past few years. So I'm excited that we finally have one of their leaders, Vibhas Ratanji, senior practice expert and executive advisor, on the show today, because we want all of our listeners to hear these culture insights straight from the horse's mouth. I had the really good fortune of watching Vibhas speak at CultureCon in Madison, Wisconsin back in August. And I knew right away we needed him to come share his wisdom with our listeners. And as everyone will soon hear, he's a perfect blend of brilliance with a splash of humor, which, to be honest, we need when discussing some of these still pervasive culture issues that many organizations are still grappling with. And speaking of culture, I want to leave with this quote before welcoming Vibhas to the stage with us into the studio. So listen to this quote from the father of organizational culture, psychologist Edgar Schein, who, by the way, just passed away this last January. This is what he said about culture. The only thing of real importance that leaders do is to create and manage culture. If you do not manage culture, it manages you, and you may not even be aware of the extent to which this is happening. Seems like a fitting quote as we welcome Vibhas to the show and we get things started today. So without further ado, let's give a warm Googleization Nation welcome to today's guest from Gallup, Vibhas Ratanji. For you, just like at CultureCon. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure being on the show. Thank you so much for having me, Jason and Ira.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a lot of meaty stuff to get into, right? We shared a lot of your data from Gallup of what's going on culture-wise. But before we get into that stuff, we always like to start with just getting to know you a little bit. Why did you really start getting interested in organizational culture? What was your path that got you here?
I've been doing this for a fairly long time, almost 25 years. And my beginnings was actually in advertising. I did my graduation and post-graduation in advertising and knew very soon that what I was really interested in was human behavior, and went on to market research and did a lot of that work for a time. And then for the past 23 years, I've actually been working with Gallup. And I think, as you mentioned, Gallup is the primary source of insights when it comes to human behavior. So I think it made perfect sense. Along the line, I actually worked in driving in organizations a culture of service excellence. I was doing a lot of work around service excellence and defining service values that went on to helping organizations define their purpose and value statements and so on. And that naturally led to kind of culture, which is such an interesting topic. And like Ira, you said, there are probably as many people, as many definitions of culture as there are people trying to define it. So I think it tends to be such an amorphous, superfluous concept, but it requires a lot of definition for leaders to be successful. So I've been kind of a culture nerd for, I guess, more than 20 years.
That's great. And to come from the advertising side, I'm sure today, a lot of our listeners, you're going to get some advertising verbology and ways to create your culture to advertise to prospective employees, folks that you're trying to attract.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that Ira and I, we sometimes hear from other guests, but we also hear from folks that we just chat with. Sometimes they're shocked when they hear these data on how bad we're still struggling with culture across the board. There are many organizations that are doing it well, but the data are pretty clear that there's still a lot of organizations struggling with it. So I guess maybe to kind of kick us off here is tell us why are we still struggling so much? Can we really trust those data when we have people that are saying, I don't think things are really that bad still in organizations?
Right. You know what? The presumption is that since the pandemic, that the pandemic caused everything, the decrease in employee engagement and so on. And we've had some dramatic shifts in terms of way we work, with hybrid working being such an important shift we're seeing. We do a larger research. Of course, we do a lot of work in the workplace area, but at Gallup, we do a poll in 150 countries. And similar to Ida, you talked about the Joy Barometer. So we actually in 150 countries measured something we call the negative experience index. And this is experienced negativity, whether it's sadness, worry, anger, loneliness, and so on. The number right now globally is about close to about 33% of those negative experiences. Now, you might say, oh, well, of course, the pandemic, it's just been so tumultuous. But the rise of global unhappiness predates the pandemic. It's been rising for a really long time. And so is employee engagement. So these are not new. These are factors that have been part of the workplace and humanity for a very long time. It's what you do about it. It's how you kind of create a difference. A lot of companies do employee surveys, of course, to gain some insights around what the employees are doing. But there's a knowing and doing gap, right? You know everything. You kind of do the survey, you put it on the shelf, and then you revisit it next year when it's time to do the survey again. A lot of our work with organizations, best practice companies, it's translating insights into action. That's a leadership responsibility.
So, Vibhas, and I might have, you have so much data, and I've downloaded so many reports that you have, and I cite them often. So I might conflate a few of them here, but one is, if I'm correct, when we're talking about unhappiness, or we're talking about disengagement, some of the questions that were asked were you angry yesterday? Were you stressed yesterday? Did you have physical pain yesterday? So these are some very, very basic questions. We're not, they're not deep and they're not complex. It's like, hey, did you hurt yesterday? Did you feel stressed yesterday? Did you feel anxious yesterday? Did you feel angry yesterday? Mm-hmm. Am I correct? Those are the questions that go into this.
Absolutely.
Happiness.
Yeah.
Which is scary, because if I recall, again, and I may be citing the global or the US number, but it's like 1 in 5 people were admitted to being angry yesterday.
There is a pandemic of loneliness, and that I think is perhaps a direct result. And I do a lot of work in healthcare, and when you look at those people who are actually actively working, but there are ways in which you can mend it. I remember working for a hospital system who, during the peak of the pandemic, obviously you can imagine the healthcare workers being so stressed out and everything we mentioned, loneliness and anger and denial and all of that, right? But there was one company I worked with, one organization who tried to put more of a positive focus. And, in healthcare, they do a lot of rounding and huddles. And this particular hospital system did huddles, but they call them hope huddles. So instead of talking about how many people kind of got on ventilators in the peak of the pandemic, they actually met for 15 minutes in the morning and talked about those folks who got off ventilators, and they call them hope huddles. So I think having kind of an appreciative mindset is critical, because there's a lot of bad news everywhere. But focusing on solutions requires a strengths-based positive mindset and behaviors. So as organizations, if you're actually articulating not just kind of what I call not the root cause analysis of failure, but defining the root cause analysis of success. So all that bad news, there's a lot that organizations and leaders can do about it. The most startling finding at the area you mentioned, you've looked at quite a lot of our research. The one that scares me the most, you mentioned the number on how many employees actually feel that they're connected to the culture of their organization. The one that scares me the most is when we actually pass that number by leaders and individual contributors. So the individual contributors were about 17 to 18%, and leaders were at 39%. So that's a 22% gap. My problem is not the 22% gap. My problem is the 39%. Only 39% of leaders feel that they're connected to the culture of their organization. I expect that to be 100%. You shouldn't be a leader if you don't know how you're defining, listening, and creating a connection with culture. That surprises me and that shocks me. So the job really is to start with leadership to make this work. Don't look at employees and say, you got to change your behaviors and you got to show up differently to work and show up and work differently as, with the hybrid environment. I think leaders need to really look at their own perspectives and how they drive performance and cultural belonging.
Yeah, that's like looking at the survey, and again, it's a congratulations, and it's a steep lift. It's a heavy lift for these organizations, but the employee engagement scores, reached an all-time high. I think 33% last year, and it's like, let's celebrate the 33%. It was up from 31 and 29, but but it's still 67% are not engaged.
That's
So
right.
I want to just differentiate this, because this really transformed the way I looked at that I personally looked at engagement before as well. So you measure engagement, but you also measure thriving. And it was pretty startling. And again, I think this might have been the 2022 data, but but I think it was 9% of employees were engaged and thriving, and 57% were not engaged and not thriving.
Yeah, that's shocking, isn't it?
Oh, it's terrifying.
And I think they kind of go hand in hand, because when you think about engagement, it's in the workplace. The questions we use are about how, I don't really call them questions. There are 12. We call it the Q12. I call them conditions. So are there conditions that actually drive performance? So kind of when we talk about Q12 or engagement, we talk about it not as a survey, but as a management framework. And there's a difference between the two. But well-being is much larger. And it's interesting, a lot of clients that I work with are actually kind of using well-being as a prime metric, which I think they should. We have a question we ask, highly predictive question, is does your company care about your well-being? And the numbers are dismal. And we've been doing it for a really long time. It's not just the pandemic, a decade of data around that. Here's what we saw, which is very interesting. So it was trudging along around 24% for many years. And the pandemic hit. What happened? 47%. I think my company cares about my well-being. That makes sense, right? Because right in the pandemic, people were like, of course we care for you, and we're over communicating, and we're, take care of yourself and so on. 45%, and so huge lift. It took less than, I think, a year and a half for it to come crashing down to the same number, 21%, right? So here's what it is. There's a lot of promises that companies are making around well-being, but they're not really walking the talk or talking the talk. Once the pandemic is gone, we've gone back to old behaviors around stress and overwork. Burnout and overwork. I hear from leaders and managers and employees that it's actually worse than it was before after the pandemic.
And Vibhash, you kind of touched on this a little bit. I think this is starting to segue into this concept of hybrid work, remote work coming into the office, that it still seems like a lot of organizations and people are still trying to find like a healthy balance of what that looks like in their life. And I remember at CultureCon, you were talking about Gallup's data on it. I believe they were called splitters and blenders.
Yeah.
But basically, people kind of fit in two categories in terms of how they work. Can you explain splitters and blenders to us when it comes to work, and the implications for maybe how that's impacting what we're seeing from a stress level with people?
Yeah, and I think this bit of research is quite interesting. So people who are splitters have definitions around the time that they're at work and then the time that's personal time. A blender is somebody who can, kind of create their own, individualize their own kind of working style based on what the manager wants, the company wants, and the customer wants, but they could be working at different times and so on. For example, me, I'm a splitter. I can work a little bit in the morning and I can do some reports in the evening and so on. What we found interesting was that when we kind of looked at the analysis in terms of what proportion is blenders versus splitters, it was 50-50. Which I find interesting because, we also looked at it by different levels. We looked at it by generations. So is there a difference? Of course, the younger generations, it's likely that most of them will be blenders and so on. It was very close to 50-50 for even younger generations like Gen Z and millennials. So I think there are a lot of assumptions that leaders make around what the ideal work arrangement should be. We know that hybrid working essentially is something that's pretty much taking over. About 52% of remote capable employees, so employees who can work remotely, 52% right now are working hybrid. And the preference for kind of hybrid and remote is about 9 in 10. 9 in 10 employees, remote capable employees. Of course, we're not talking about those who have to be on site, like healthcare professionals or manufacturing and so on. But about 9 in 10 do want to work either in a hybrid or a remote preference. But I think a lot of leaders want them to come back to work, So that there's the other kind of issue and friction there. But it's, you got to move away from rules to reasons. The right question is not this is the rule and you've got to be there because that's the rule, that's the office policy, and that's the way we roll now. What are the reasons why people, actually want to work in a hybrid environment? Are we asking those questions? Because at the end of the day, it is about individualization. I've known many leaders and managers who actually have worked much more. The productivity has gone up because of a hybrid setup, including me. And I spend most of my time with clients anyway, so I'm traveling a whole lot. So I think leaders, instead of that insistence of office policy, I mean, there can be an exception policy, of course, but the rest of it is individualization. So I think the whole thing about asking questions to understand, are you a blender or are you a splitter? How can I individualize, how you work? The question is not, do you walk into work? The question is, how can you be most productive, irrespective of where you're working and how you're working? I don't think those questions are being asked because there's a preference for some people to grab and get more people walk through the doors. Our research shows us, and we made this prediction a while ago at the beginning of the pandemic. Our prediction was that there'll be about a 37% reduction overall of time in office. 37% of seats will be empty. And we were right. That's pretty much what we're seeing now, 3 years or so after the pandemic. Now, instead of kind of changing it and revoking to old habits, we have to navigate it for what it is. You have to work with this new reality rather than going against it. I think that's the key there.
I love the individualization part. And I can just speak from my personal story and journey in this change of work environment of the answer for me is it depends whether I want to be in an office or whether I want to work from home. My context is I have 4 boys under the age of 9. And so there's days where it can be really challenging when they're all here at home to be able to get work done because of the number of distractions. But on that day, I've got to be a blender, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to do a couple of hours of work here. Then I got to do some stuff to help the family, help the kids. Then I'll get back to work. So it's kind of more of a start and stop. Most days, my preferred mode is once I get going, my focus and attention, I'm more like an aircraft carrier. It's like, let me keep heading that direction without paying a mental tax of shifting back and forth. And I can't help but think, as you were just sharing the difference between splitters and blenders, if maybe there's some people that, yeah, they do like a lot of the freedoms that comes with it. I do love working remotely, but it can be a challenge too on certain days when there's things that, are work disruptions. And so then that means later on in the evening, then that's when you got to play some catch up. And I can't help but think that those are some pretty big factors that certainly not my experiences and everyone else's, but at least for people that are in this demographic of young parents, I'm guessing they would share probably similar stories as to how it's been challenging trying to have your foot in both waters.
And we have the data to prove it because we know that hybrid employees right now are the most engaged in terms of engagement with the organization. Guess who's the least engaged? On-site. Least engagement overall. So hybrid is kind of the new way. We did some research to kind of figure out, so what is ideal hybrid? And that was interesting because we kind of obviously measure engagement to see, okay, number of days and how many days is actually peak. And we found out the magic number is 3. If you actually have 3 days on site and if you're hybrid, that seems to have the most impact on engagement. And there are 2 days you want to avoid. You want to avoid manic Mondays. That doesn't work if you're in the office. You want to avoid freaky Fridays, or they should be more like flexible Fridays, if you may. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, hybrid. But here's the key, and here's the kicker. It's not about kind of saying, okay, hybrid will let you be in the office and for 2 or 3 days, and that's good enough. You can work from home for the rest. It's what employees are doing when they are walking into work. And I've been to a lot of client sites where I see people are working hybrid. They're in the office and they're still on Zoom meetings with each other the other way down the hall. Like that's not good use of hybrid. We asked hybrid employees what do they value the most about working hybrid, and they said it's collaboration. So I think hybrid are culture opportunities. It's the opportunity to build culture. If you're walking into work, your manager's not there, you get on a few Zoom meetings and Teams meetings, and then you leave without having a connection with working with someone, solving a customer problem, creating engagement, coaching your team members, then you just lost opportunities. So it's not about how many days you're at work, it's what you're doing when you're hybrid and whether you're actually maximizing what you can do and your strengths there.
I love that you said that, Vibhas, because I was at a conference a few weeks ago, or actually a few months ago now, and I was speaking and I shared that the story. We were talking hybrid engagement. We talked about basically culture. And somebody came up to me and said, I walked into an office yesterday and walked down the hallway, and I was shocked. There was no one there. There was the whole department. And he said, this is, there must be a meeting. Something must be going on. And until she heard a voice, and she looked and she saw there was a door crack and somebody was on the screen. All 10 rooms were occupied with people talking to each other in the office on Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
They were still in their office doing that. This whole debate about engagement and hybrid work, and you can't develop that. I said this before. I said it put management and leadership to the test. Mm-hmm. And frankly, similar to what we're talking about, is like the pandemic didn't cause these low engagement scores and low thriving scores and high negative happiness scores. It just ripped the curtain back. It's like the Wizard of Oz, and you realize that it was never really, really good before. People were good at an engagement before, and yes, remote, doing things through a screen are a little bit more challenging, but they weren't very good before, and they just showed how bad they were.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So we're going to take a short break here, but when we come back, we want to do two things. One is we want to talk about why should anybody care? So we're talking about all these scores and the negativity and the low engagement. So you have some tremendous case studies of why companies should care. But the other thing is, we a couple of weeks ago, we've been interviewing a lot of people. My focus recently has been a part of my focus has been on the neuroscience. How can what we've learned about our brains, and a lot of the things that we learned were myths. And we continue to manage according to myth rather than fact. But they talked about this one neuroscientist was talking about Gallup, the employee engagement score, and sort of looking at it that it's a retrospective. It's a survey of how they felt yesterday rather than how they felt right now and going forward. Mm-hmm. So I want to get your take on that. Want to know where you're going, because I'm sure you're there's things behind the scenes that you're doing, especially with neuroscience, because I saw your head shaking. So I'm sure related to that. And I think that's that's going to be super critical. He actually has there's a tool they have. It's called Tuesday. It's an immersion, and during the show he actually raised it and said how engaged he was in this conversation. And I can tell you, if I add that on right now, we would be in the 90s. We would be very, very high engagement, and hopefully the same to you. And I'm sure our listeners are hopefully getting the same out of this conversation that we are. But we're going to take a short break. We're with Vibhas Ratanji from Gallup, talking about one of our favorite subjects: employee engagement, employee experience, thriving at work, company culture, Googleization, all those things. We will be right back in a minute. But before we do that, I just wanted to remind everybody, and you might have seen the banner going before, not remind anybody, announce to everybody, because we didn't do it yet. In addition to being on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn Live, and on all the podcasts, being in the top 1.5% of all the podcasts, top 100 of Apple, we are now on Roku. So anybody who has a Roku TV, they can do that. If you don't have Roku, you can actually go to FAM TV, FAMTV Plus, PLUS.com. And our shows are now on replay on Roku and FAM Plus, or FAMTVPlus.com. So we'll be everywhere. We'll be everywhere. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Are your employees feeling stuck and just showing up for a paycheck? Is your workforce working harder to get back to normal than adapting to the future? It's time to help them break their addiction to certainty and develop a growth mindset. Developed by one of the world's top-rated future of work thought leaders, AQ Plus Mindset is a powerful tool to help your employees embrace change, adapt faster, and grow on the job. Conveniently delivered to any smartphone or laptop in easy-to-digest 5 to 10-minute lessons. Managers can sit back and watch employee attitude shift towards growth and innovation in just 30 days. Are you ready to help your employees thrive in this ever-changing, never-normal world? Encourage them to show more grit, resilience, adaptability, and unlock their potential? The journey to a growth-filled future starts with a growth mindset. Visit aqplusmindset.com or call 484-373-4300.
Welcome back to Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization. We're Vibhas Ratanji from Gallup, having a fascinating conversation on a highly engaging, speaking of engagement, highly engagement conversation, talking about employee engagement, company culture, people, how to make, I don't know if we'll ever create joy at work, but at least we won't create as many negative experiences as we have been going there. Vibhas, when we left off, we're going to talk, let's tackle this first, is why should companies care? I know, this whole thing, I mean, hey, wages are going up, people are getting paid more, benefits, hey, we're giving people some flexibility, we're doing a couple things, it's not ratcheting the scores up a whole lot. So why should there be more of a concerted effort? Why should companies care?
And I mentioned earlier that the survey that we have, engagement survey, we call it more of a management framework of sorts, because I think one thing we need to make sure is that everything you do around research around employees is predictive of future success. So you're looking at engagement as a leading indicator. It's not a lagging indicator. And there's a lot of lagging indicators that leaders look at, performance and profit and so on. These are all lagging indicators. They've happened already. Engagement of customers and employees, these are leading indicators, but it's the questions you ask and whether they're predictive or not. So our research actually, and we've talked to millions of employees, and we've actually correlated the results of what they're saying to business outcomes. And across a whole range of business outcomes, we've seen connections to these 12 conditions that I talked about. And that's why we don't call them survey questions, and business outcomes and turnover, customer satisfaction. It's absolutely amazing when I work with healthcare and I see the connection between engagement and mortality. So if you were to think about in hospital systems and hospitals where you have high levels of engagement, they're actually saving more lives. So there's a lot of reasons. There are business reasons, of course, for why investing in engagement is important, and a whole host of metrics show us that's the case. But there are other reasons as well. You're doing it because you care for your employees at the end of the day, and I think that's important. And like I said, in healthcare, you're saving lives. So there's certainly a business outcome or statistical linkages that Gallup can talk about. We've done tremendous amounts of meta-analysis across different data sets to actually come up with those conclusions. And organizations who've done that, you said some best practice cases. I don't know that I can name names there, but there are quite a few organizations, who've done that exceptionally well. We call them the Gallup Great Workplace Award winners. You mentioned engaged being around 30-odd%. That's true, about 32% for the US. It's about 23% globally in terms of engagement. For these best practice organizations, those numbers are above 70%. Imagine walking into a workplace which is 70 to 75% engaged. And you'll see the difference. You walk into a retail store, which is 70% engaged. And you'll see the difference not just in how employees are, you'll also see it in how customers are, in terms of that brand becoming a much loved brand. I talked about the decrease in employee engagement since the pandemic. We've seen the single largest decline on employee engagement than we've ever seen since we started measuring many years ago. But guess what else we saw? I don't know whether you guys are familiar with the American Customer Satisfaction Index. It's an index that I think that 28 years they've been doing it. It's a satisfaction metrics across industries. We see almost a similar drop in the American Customer Satisfaction Index, which hasn't changed in 28 years. So that's telling you something. That's telling you that there is a direct connection. And our research at Gallup, we've done a lot of that. There's a direct connection between employee engagement and customer engagement. But the one part that gets overlooked is the role of the manager in driving that. So what we're really saying here is if you want to drive outcomes, performance, and customer outcomes, focus on your managers. Why? Because they create employee engagement. 70% of the variance on employee engagement is the manager. We wrote a book a long time ago. It's called First Break All the Rules. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's a legendary book. And the numbers on engagement, and we talked about the role of the manager, it's very important and so on. And we look at the numbers now, it's the same. So we wrote another book a few years ago, and it's called It's the Manager. So almost we're telling people it's the manager, folks, or it's the manager, stupid. But I think that's the key. It's like, are you investing in your managers to be able to create engagement, or are you just putting together a bunch of recognition policies, employee of the month, and hoping that your employees will be happy with you? So really a focus on manager is key there.
Vivash, you bring up an interesting thing there when you talked about you can feel the difference in organizations that have like the 70% of people engaged. Like if you're a customer and you walk in, you can be like, okay, this place, they get it. There's something here about their culture that makes it strong. But in one of your articles, I think this is a fascinating angle that you took. Sometimes maybe organizations may overemphasize a particular aspect of their culture, and there's an unintended consequence from just focusing on that one aspect of the culture when there might be some other ingredients that they need to focus on. And the example you gave was of a professional services firm that was highly collaborative. So that part of their culture was like A+, outstanding. But because they were so narrowly focused on being a collaborative culture, Gallup found that in the work that you're doing with them, you found that they were really struggling with adaptability, with agility, with the ability to make quicker decisions because they were overdoing maybe the collaboration piece too much. So can you speak a little bit to us in terms of engagement and culture, how they're intertwined?
Yeah.
How is it that sometimes we might actually overdo our strengths in our culture and not pay attention to some of the other things that are important that we need to improve?
Yeah. And yeah, that was a great case study in an organization we worked with. And I kind of call it the push and pull of culture, because culture is very complex and it's nuanced and it's multidimensional. It's not, I mean, typically when leaders talk about culture, they talk about the core values. Like, this is who we are, this is how we operate, and so on. And culture is a lot more complex than just a bunch of words on a wall, you know. It's behaviors we're talking about. And with this organization, it was interesting. Besides that, there were many other elements at play. You won't know those elements unless you actually go in and study culture in an organization. So the first step is actually to almost, we call it a culture audit, to kind of go in and say, hey, what's your culture about? What it is and what it's not. And you'll find a lot of great insights just asking great questions about your culture. Not just asking great questions. That's something that leaders don't do enough of, is immersing themselves in the world of the employee and the world of the customer. I think there was some research. I wrote an article on this a while ago where I think CEOs spend less than 3% of their time. It was a Harvard Business Review article with customers. Now that's shocking, you know, because the higher you go on this hierarchy, the far further away you are from the customer and you're dealing with whatever you're dealing with. So I think the push and pull of culture, you need to be able to understand that nuance. And I work with this amazing organization, can't name them, but they did something really interesting. You know, typically when you kind of build a culture narrative, like this is who we are, and a definition of that, you talk about aspirational culture, which is, you know, who we want to become. You know, it's not that we are right now all this great stuff we're saying about ourselves. It's we want to become this, right? What this organization did was they talked about who we are and the behaviors that are great, and they also talked about behaviors that they should limit, which I thought was really interesting. And there's takes a lot of courage to say these are some, you know, if you're a Star Wars fan, these are the light side and this is the dark side of our culture, which we should acknowledge, right? It's like one of the things I think that they mentioned was, you know, we focus on perfectionism. Now, if you're trying to be very kind of flowery with your language, you'll say strive for perfection is a cultural value and all of that. No, they say we actually struggle with this because everything doesn't have to be perfect, you know, and you have to work with it and you have to improvise and so on. So I think somewhere organizations need to get that realization that static definitions of culture are not enough, that they have to be dynamic, they have to be real, they have to be rooted in behaviors that you see, both the positive, the neutral, and the negative, and then bring that to the fore. Because, you know, like I said, culture is complex. You can't just, I always use this as an example. You know, if you think about cultural values, respect, integrity, teamwork, and excellence. These are the 4 values of a fantastic, great organization. And then I tell them, this is actually Enron. Remember Enron? Oh, yeah. Respect, integrity, teamwork, and excellence. Nobody would say this is a bad organization. Yeah, so it's not about, it's like really get real and authentic about your culture. Acknowledge what you do really well and acknowledge where you're struggling. Employees will value that more than just flowery language on your mission statement.
Boss, I mentioned this right before our break, and I want to make sure we cover that because unfortunately we're running out of time. How has neuroscience, how is the advance of neuroscience, what we've learned, how people actually, how their brain works when we're engaged, when they're thriving, when they're joyful, when they're happy or unhappy, how has that impacted your ability to, or not, well, not your approach and your ability to get more accurate, more predictive information?
So we work with quite a few economists and psychologists. I mean, the one that we work with quite extensively and have worked with quite extensively is Danny Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. So he's not even an economist; he's actually a psychologist. First psychologist to actually get a Nobel Prize in economics. My personal favorite, as far as the brain science is concerned, is Joseph Ledoux, in terms of synaptic self and all the stuff that he's done. We've done some interesting work there. So I'll talk about it from the customer perspective. It's what matters to a customer is you almost need to do. So we actually had customers. We actually had an fMRI machine, and can you imagine the stuff that Gallup does is sticking people into an fMRI machine and asking them a bunch of questions about their favorite brands, and we were trying to look at those brain scans and so on. What we tried to see was, again, behavior and memory around what creates a sense of engagement, right? And create a sense of engagement is defined as those parts of your brain that light up when you ask certain questions. And we found out that when we asked certain questions, the amygdala lit up, which is the emotional center of the brain, right? So it's about association, and it's about the emotional connections you have. So a lot of the questions that we've created are tested to be emotionally focused. So we have a question like, do you have a best friend at work? It's one of our more controversial questions, which is like, why are you asking that kind of question? What kind of question is that? Why? Because we've seen that it matters. If you have an emotional connection with someone at work, may not be your manager, and we've actually looked at statistical, scientific research that backs that up. You'd rather ask that question than a question like, do you like the food in the canteen? So I think with neuroscience, what's happening is that how the brain reacts to emotional stimulus, and then by valuing that emotional connection that people have with workplaces and with brand, and making the right decisions as leaders to drive the emotional economy, that's more important than just business as usual. Let's get profits high and all that. You can't do that because emotional engagement is predictive of your financial economy. So invest in the emotional economy, and the financial economy will take care of itself.
There is so much there to go down. The one thing that comes to mind is in just a few weeks, Michael Platt, who's head of research at the University of Pennsylvania, will be on. I actually took a course with him over the summer, a certificate course at Wharton, and they did a great study with the branding with Apple and Samsung. And with Apple, people responded favorably. They heard Apple, they were engaged. The parts of the brain lit up. With Samsung, they actually negatively lit up when they heard the word Apple, or it was a negative association with them. And what they found out about the branding was that Apple people were engaged, they were enthusiastic, they were part of a community, where Samsung was anti-Apple. The reason that people went to Samsung, or the people that stay at work, is because they're anti going to someplace else.
Yeah, that's really
which is not a good reason to have them there. So a bunch of kind of a bad call.
Professor Kahneman's research and our research suggests that when it comes to decision making, 70% of decision making is emotional.
Yeah,
but we spend most of our time on the 30%, which is rational.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's messy. I mean, dealing with the emotional stuff is messy for leaders. So, but it's really important. It's critical. It's predictive of future success.
Yeah, I mentioned before about the watch and what Paul Zak did they were able to take the readings from the fMRIs or
fMRI.
fMRI, yeah. Too many letters in my head at the moment. They were able to take the data from there and correlate it to what he was able to measure through an app. Not relatively accurate to that. So we're advancing that. We don't have to put everybody in an FRI.
I do have a point to make there. I think that's an interesting point you mentioned about the role that technology will play increasingly in driving engagement, whether it's through wearables and what they're calling augmented reality and so on. I wrote an article on this, and I call it augmented leadership or augmented humanity. I think at the end of the day, 70% of decision making is emotional. You'll have to work with people, and technology can enable you, but at the end of the day, it's personal, emotional connections matter more than technology-enabled interface.
Yeah, I was just on a panel just last week, and we talked about that with AI, and we had our fears of AI taking the job, and it was a group of actually, it was interesting. It was called the Broadcasting Pioneers, and there were a lot of people that were, there was half the group that was pioneering, and the half the group was anti-pioneering. But one of the things that came up was with AI, and one of my responses to one of the questions was, AI is a tool.
Yeah.
AI is a tool. It helps make you more human, makes you better at what you do. And people think it's an either or, it's a binary choice. It's either man or machine, and it can be man and machine because it's a great tool. It certainly helped, ChatGPT, and not even out a year, but has helped me in tremendous ways become better at doing a lot of things that I was good at or okay at before, but it's helped me a great deal. So there's ways to use it, and there's ways to misuse it, like everything else. Unfortunately, we are coming up to pretty close to our end. We can be taught. We can continue this all day long if you had time with us. But there's one question we always like to close this segment with, which is there something that we should have asked you that we didn't? There's a lot of questions we should have asked you, but we're just running out of time. But is there one particular one that you wish we would have asked?
I think we covered a lot of ground, so I'm not sure.
Well, we'll take that if we can get our guests to say this is good. We covered a lot. We'll take that.
Yeah, Gallup research is unending. We are committed to just listening to the workplace for a fairly long time, and we do this quarterly. We're listening every day to employees and to customers and to people in general. So there's a lot of great insight that's coming, and it's free to use. You go to gallup.com and you just type in a topic that you want insights and intelligence on, and it's there. That's our commitment to making us all stronger.
Well, and Ira and I, you probably would notice our IP address is there every day. If we gave those to you, you'd be like, who is it from Pennsylvania and Indiana that's on here every day, spending hours looking at this data? It's such good stuff.
Yeah,
wonderful to.
You can just add another G to Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization. It's Gallup, Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization.
There you go. I like it. Absolutely. New alliteration. I love it, Vibhas. Well, the next segment we're going to do is we get ready to wrap up. We just want to get to know you a little bit better on a personal level and help the listeners too. Because obviously there's professional Vibhas. We want to get to know the personal Vibhas a little bit more too. So let's start with this one. Mm-hmm. What is something that people wouldn't guess about you? Like a hidden talent or something where they'd be like, well, that kind of surprises me about Vibhas. That's cool.
I'm an amateur cartoonist. So I actually used to do a fair bit of cartooning, and I even had a strip a long time ago, which was only online, but a lot of people don't know that about me.
Oh, that's cool. So we got to learn a little bit more about that and dig into it. What was it about? What was the characters, the theme?
It was about the workplace. It was a Dilbert knockoff is what I'd call it.
I was about to say you're probably the Dilbert creator then, and you're just playing Corythus and being humble. That is very cool. We'll have to see if we can get some samples from you sometime. We'd love to see that.
Sure. Yeah.
How about this one? If there was one person in the history of the world that you could spend the day with and learn from or chat with, who would it be, you think?
My all-time hero is Bruce Springsteen, the boss. And just in terms of the sage from New York, New Jersey, it's just there's such a plethora of life lessons and learning about working hard and about persevering. I would love to spend any time I can do with the boss there.
I love that. That's cool. And that kind of almost answers another question we often ask, which is, who is your favorite band or musician? And it sounds like probably the boss. If not it, he'd at least be up there.
Yeah. If I can spend half a day with the boss and the rest of it with Led Zeppelin, I can die. I can die happy.
I love that.
Led Zeppelin in their
That's
prime, not the way they are now. Led Zeppelin
Right.
in their prime.
That's awesome. And then one more. Let's say that you had like one wish on a genie's lamp, and it had to be an experience, like some kind of experience that you would go and do. What would be at the top of like your bucket list to something that you'd want to go do?
Money is no object.
Money is no object. You get a wish. You get to do anything that you want.
Spend a day in the International Space Station and look at the planet from up there.
I like it. That's awesome. Very cool, Vibhas. Thank you so much for doing our lightning round with us. Let us get to know you a little bit better and help the listeners as well. Obviously, you are a leader at Gallup, and so folks can go to gallup.com. But are there any other places where people can connect with you and learn more about the incredible work that you all are doing at Gallup?
Connect with me on LinkedIn. I post a lot of stories. I post a lot of research, everything new that's coming in from Gallup and articles and so on. Go to gallup.com. Like I said, there's such a plethora of research and insights right there. We write articles very often, and gallup.com is your one-stop shop in terms of insights and analytics about the workplace. I highly encourage everybody to visit our website.
Perfect. Well, Vibhas, thank you so much for sharing part of your day with us and with our listeners. It's absolutely incredible. It went by way too quickly, and hopefully we can get you back on again in the future.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Ditto on that, Vibhas. I appreciate it. So happy and grateful that your voice held out. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. And we'll be in touch. But what a highly engaging opportunity to have a conversation, and we'll definitely love to have you back again. So.
Sounds good. Cheers.
I love, Ira, that Vibhas said there really isn't anything else to cover. We covered almost everything, and we did. That went by quickly. What were some of the big takeaways or aha moments for you today?
Well, I'll argue with both of you. I think there's a whole lot more to cover. But we did cover a lot of territory in that 45 minutes. I think just a lot of confirmation. The one stat that he brought up earlier, and again, it seems to be the trend. I believe it was like 39% of leaders. I had not heard that one before. Only 39% of leaders are actually engaged, with their culture. Which is just shocking. And it's like, hey, it was 18% higher than the employees, but how could you possibly, have almost 6 out of 10 leaders not engaged?
Yeah, my hypothesis is maybe they're so busy with the other stuff that they don't get to the culture, but it's like you need to reverse. You need to get the other stuff set first. Otherwise, eventually you're going to burn out and things are going to crash down if you don't have the good, solid foundation set.
Yeah, leaders lead.
Right. The other part to me that was really eye-opening today, too, is when we were talking about return to the office mandates. And Vibhas was talking about how, sadly, what those mandates look like for an employee in a lot of industries is they go into the office, they shut their door, they hop on their computer, and then they're on Zoom calls for most of the day. It's not like there's this rich collaboration, this rich person-to-person connection type stuff that's going on, which are the real reasons to get people on a hybrid schedule so that you are doing that stuff. It's because leaders just want people under their thumb when it gets down to the brass tacks. It was just interesting to hear him lay it out as most of these places that are doing RTO, their people are coming in, and it's not like they're engaging or getting any kind of additional value whatsoever. They're literally doing the exact same thing, activities and behaviors that they'd be doing at home. So that's just an important reminder also. We want to thank you, Googleization Nation, for tuning in today. If you haven't liked or subscribed to the podcast on your favorite podcast platforms, please do so. We're also on YouTube. Give us a follow on Instagram as well. And until next time, I'm Jason Cochran signing off.
And I'm Ira Wolf. Remember, you can also now watch us on Roku or famtvplus.com. Either one. Thank you for being part of Googleization Nation. And until next week, don't let the shift hit your plans.
Thanks for watching Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization. Be sure to listen to the podcast and follow us on YouTube. This show was produced and edited by Hilton